On the biggest day of her life, something went terribly wrong. A single moment changed everything, exposing a truth she never saw coming. But what happened next will shock you. Watch till the end to find out the unbelievable truth. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the polished wooden floor of Amalia's bedroom. It should have been a day filled with nothing but anticipation, yet something deep inside her refused to settle. A week from now, she would be standing before her family and friends, pledging her love to Daniel, the man she had believed was the perfect match for her. The man everyone around her adored. The man her mother constantly praised. The man her friends envied her for. Yet, as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the delicate lace of her wedding gown hanging near the window, a shadow of unease crept through her chest, an inexplicable heaviness pressing down on her ribs. She had met Daniel 2 years ago at a corporate fundraiser, an event she had attended with little enthusiasm, only to leave that night believing in destiny. He was charming, articulate, and carried himself with an effortless confidence. There was an elegance in the way he spoke, a quiet intelligence in his words that drew people in. He had seen her in a way no one else had before, or at least that's what she had convinced herself. She had planned every detail of this wedding meticulously, ensuring nothing less than perfection. The venue, the flowers, the dress, the guest list, it was all aligned to create the flawless day she had always imagined. And yet the unease lingered, a whisper in the back of her mind that refused to quiet. She blamed it on pre-wedding jitters, told herself it was natural to feel nervous before such a life-changing moment. But deep down, she knew it was something more. A sudden shift in the air made her turn her head. Near the window, perched atop his usual spot on the wooden beam stretching across the high ceiling, her golden eagle watched her with piercing amber eyes. His sharp gaze never wavered, his talons gripping the wood tightly, his feathers slightly ruffled as if he, too, sensed something was wrong. Amalia had raised him from a fledgling, cared for him, trained him, and in return he had remained fiercely loyal, always watching, always protecting. He had never once acted aggressively toward anyone she had brought into her life. Until Daniel. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. The eagle would stare at Daniel with unsettling intensity whenever he visited, never fully relaxing in his presence. Then came the warning cries, the slight shifts in posture, the way he would spread his wings when Daniel walked into the room as if preparing for something unseen. Daniel had laughed it off at first, joking that the bird was jealous, calling him territorial. But as the weeks passed and the wedding preparations intensified, the eagle's behavior escalated. The first real sign had come a month ago when Daniel had leaned in to kiss her goodbye. The moment his lips touched hers, the eagle let out a piercing shriek, launching from his perch and swooping down between them with an aggressive flap of his wings. Amalia had been startled, but Daniel had been furious. His usual easy charm cracked for the first time as he snapped at her to do something about the bird. She had never seen him so angry, and for a brief moment, something in his eyes had unsettled her. Since then, the eagle had made his position clear. He positioned himself between them whenever possible, his sharp gaze locked onto Daniel like a hunter tracking its prey. His cries grew louder whenever Daniel was near, his wings spread wider in silent defiance. Daniel, who had once found amusement in the bird's presence, grew more and more impatient. "He's getting worse," Daniel had said just a few nights ago, his voice carefully measured, but the irritation underneath unmistakable. Maybe he should stay somewhere else for a while, just until the wedding is over. Amalia had hesitated. The thought of being without the eagle, even temporarily, unsettled her. He had been with her for years, through every up and down, always a silent guardian. But Daniel had smiled, reassuring, understanding. "I'm not saying forever," he had added smoothly, "just so he doesn't ruin the big day." She had agreed, albeit reluctantly, but that night, as she lay in bed, she had been startled awake by a sharp cry from the hallway. She had sat up, her heart hammering in her chest, only to find the eagle standing at the threshold of her bedroom, his body rigid, wings slightly spread, eyes locked onto something unseen in the darkness beyond. He refused to move even when she whispered his name. The unease that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks now coiled tightly in her stomach. The following morning, she had gone downstairs to find the eagle perched near the doorway, watching her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. When she reached out to stroke his feathers, he didn't lean into her touch as he usually did. Instead, he remained motionless, his gaze flickering toward the closet where Daniel kept a few of his belongings. She had laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to some strange instinct. But now, sitting in front of her vanity, staring at her reflection, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. A knock at the door made her jump slightly. She turned as the door opened, revealing her best friend, Lauren, sunglasses perched on her head, a to-go coffee in her hand, and a skeptical look in her eyes. "Mornin', bride-to-be," Lauren greeted, stepping inside before Amalia could even say a word. She set the coffee down on the dresser and crossed her arms. "You look like you haven't slept." Amalia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Wedding stress?" Lauren arched a brow. "Wedding stress, or your ego acting like your fiancé is Satan himself?" Amalia hesitated before shaking her head. "He's just being territorial. You know how he is." Lauren hummed, clearly unconvinced. "Or maybe he sees something you don't." Amalia let out a small laugh, but it was hollow. "Like what? That I'm about to marry a man he doesn't approve of?" Lauren didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned against the counter, her expression serious. "Animals pick up on things we don't. There's a reason he doesn't like Daniel." Amalia opened her mouth to argue, but found herself hesitating, because deep down, she had been thinking the same thing. That night, as she sat on the couch, stroking the eagle's feathers while Daniel scrolled through his phone across from her, she studied him in a way she never had before. He looked as composed as ever, his navy shirt crisp, his hair perfectly styled, his expression unreadable. He was perfect. So why did it feel like something was wrong? The eagle suddenly lifted his head, his feathers ruffling, his sharp eyes fixed on Daniel. Then, with deliberate movements, he spread his wings and let out a slow, deliberate cry, his talons digging into the wooden armrest. Daniel looked up, and for the first time Amalia saw something unfamiliar in his gaze, a flicker of something dark, something cold. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual easy smile. "Still don't like me, huh?" he said, forcing a chuckle. The eagle didn't move. Daniel sighed, standing. "I should go. Big day coming up, right?" He leaned down and kissed Amalia's forehead before she could react. "Try to get some sleep." She nodded automatically, still watching her eagle, who turned his head just slightly, his gaze never leaving Daniel as he walked to the door. The moment it clicked shut, the eagle let out a slow, low cry, a warning, and for the first time Amalia wasn't sure she could ignore it. Amalia woke up with a strange heaviness in her chest, as if the weight of something unseen was pressing down on her. The morning light streamed in through the large bedroom windows, illuminating the delicate embroidery of her wedding dress hanging by the closet. It was supposed to be a beautiful sight, a reminder of the most important day of her life approaching. But all she felt was unease. She sat up slowly, running a hand through her hair, glancing towards the wooden beam near the ceiling. Her eagle was perched there, unmoving, his sharp amber eyes locked onto her as if waiting for her to acknowledge something she wasn't ready to face. He had not left his usual spot all night. Normally, he would wake before her, shifting his position to the windowsill to watch the world outside. But this morning, he was still there, watching her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She threw off the covers and stepped onto the cold wooden floor, stretching. Downstairs, she could hear the faint sound of coffee brewing, meaning someone was already up. Probably her mother, buzzing around in excitement. She sighed and moved toward her vanity, trying to shake off the restless feeling. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe Lauren was right. Pre-wedding anxiety could make anyone overthink. But when she glanced in the mirror, she noticed the way her eagle had repositioned himself. He was no longer watching her. His gaze was fixed on the closed door of her bedroom, his body still, wings slightly lifted as if preparing to take flight. Amalia followed his stare, her fingers tightening on the edge of the vanity table. There was nothing there, just the door. And yet, a strange uneasiness settled deeper into her stomach. A sharp knock startled her. "Amalia?" It was her mother's voice. "Come downstairs, sweetheart. The tailor is here for the final fitting." She exhaled, forcing herself to shake off the feeling. "Come in." As she turned away, the eagle let out a low, drawn-out sound. Not a cry, but something softer, like a warning. Amalia hesitated before stepping out. Downstairs, her mother was fussing over last-minute wedding details while the tailor carefully laid out fabric samples, making small adjustments to the dress. Amalia tried to focus, but her mind was elsewhere. She felt the weight of her eagle's eyes even from another room, his silent presence pressing against the back of her thoughts. Every time Daniel was around, he acted differently. More alert, more aggressive. "You're distracted," Lauren's voice cut through her thoughts. She was leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping her coffee, eyes narrowed in amusement. "Is it wedding stress, or are you still thinking about the bird?" Amalia sighed, rubbing her temples. "He's just been acting strange lately. I don't know. It's probably nothing." Lauren studied her for a long moment before setting her coffee down. "Or maybe it's something. You ever consider that?" Amalia forced a small laugh. "Like what?" Lauren shrugged. "Like maybe he sees something you don't." The words lingered longer than they should have. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amalia sat curled up on the couch, her mind restless despite the quiet hum of the television in the background. Her eagle was perched nearby, eyes fixed on the darkening sky outside. He had barely moved all day, except to follow her whenever she left the room. She couldn't remember the last time he had been this tense. She absent-mindedly reached for her phone, scrolling through messages from friends, well wishes, reminders for wedding preparations. Daniel's name appeared on her screen, a simple text. "Dinner tomorrow? Just us. Let's take a break from the chaos." She hesitated before typing a quick, "Sounds good," but the moment she sent it, her eagle let out a sharp cry, his wings flaring for a brief second before settling again. The sound sent a jolt through her. He had done that once before, the night she first agreed to move forward with the wedding. Something was wrong. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and no matter how many times she tossed and turned, her body refused to relax. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, glancing toward the door. Her eagle was standing there again, watching, guarding. His feathers were puffed slightly, his talons gripping the wooden floor. She whispered his name, but he didn't move. Then she heard it. A noise, quiet, almost imperceptible, coming from outside her bedroom. A slow, deliberate creak. Her pulse spiked, her breath catching in her throat. It could have been the house settling. It could have been the wind. But her eagle's posture told her otherwise. He was alert, wings slightly lifted, completely still except for the slow turn of his head toward the sound. She swallowed, gripping the blankets. The silence stretched unbearably. Then another sound, a faint click. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She forced herself to breathe, shaking her head. It was probably nothing. Maybe her mother moving around. Maybe a door shifting from the draft. But as she glanced at her eagle, his gaze remained locked on the door. She stayed awake until the first light of morning filtered through the curtains. When she finally got up, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, she walked past the closet and hesitated. Something felt off. She reached for the handle and pulled the door open. Inside, hanging neatly, were Daniel's clothes. A few shirts, a jacket. The scent of his cologne faintly lingered in the air. It should have been normal, but it wasn't, because her eagle was standing directly in front of it, eyes locked onto the fabric, completely still, as if something inside that closet wasn't supposed to be there. Her stomach twisted. She backed away. She didn't know why, but she didn't want to touch anything inside that closet. And she didn't know why it felt like a warning. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations, floral arrangements, and last-minute adjustments that should have occupied Amalia's mind, but she felt distant from it all. The unease hadn't left her. If anything, it had worsened. She could barely focus on the wedding planner's questions, barely register her mother's excitement. Her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in a web of doubt she didn't want to acknowledge. Her golden eagle had been restless all morning, shifting between his usual perch and the nearest window, his sharp gaze following her movements. She had never seen him like this before. He wasn't just tense, he was waiting, watching. For what, she didn't know. Lauren arrived just before noon, dressed casually in leggings and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She took one look at Amalia and let out a low whistle. "Wow, you look like someone who just found out their fiancé has a secret wife and 3 kids in another state." Amalia shot her a tired look. "Good morning to you, too." Lauren plopped onto the couch, kicking her feet up on the ottoman. "All right, spill. You've been weird for weeks, but today, you look like you're about to walk to your own execution, not down the aisle." Amalia hesitated. She wanted to brush it off, tell Lauren she was just nervous, that wedding jitters were normal. But when she met her best friend's eyes, she saw something she hadn't been willing to face. Concern. She exhaled, sinking into the chair opposite her. "It's nothing. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking everything?" Lauren took a sip of her coffee, studying her. "Or maybe you're finally thinking clearly for the first time in months." Amalia frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Lauren set her cup down. "It means I've been waiting for you to admit something is off. And let's be real, your bird figured it out before you did." Amalia let out a humorless laugh. "You sound like you actually think he knows something I don't." Lauren didn't laugh. "Maybe he does." Silence stretched between them. Amalia wanted to dismiss it, wanted to call her ridiculous, but she couldn't. Not after everything. Lauren leaned forward. "Look, I love you, And I'm not saying Daniel is a serial killer or a con artist or whatever insane theory is running through my head right now, but Amalia, that bird of yours, he's never acted like this. And the fact that he's only like this when Daniel is around, that's not nothing. Amalia swallowed, her fingers tightening in her lap. I don't want to doubt him. I don't want to believe I made a mistake. Lauren's expression softened. And I get that, but if something feels wrong, it probably is. Amalia bit her lip, staring at the floor. What am I supposed to do, Lauren? Call off the wedding because my eagle doesn't like him? Lauren shook her head. No, you call off the wedding if you don't like him, if you don't trust him. Amalia's stomach twisted. I do trust him. Lauren arched a brow. Then why are you hesitating? The question lodged itself in her chest, heavy and unavoidable. She didn't have an answer. That evening, she sat curled up on her couch, the soft glow of a candle flickering on the coffee table. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic outside. Daniel had texted, saying he was busy with last-minute work, but that he'd see her soon. Normally, she would have felt relief at the brief moment of solitude, but tonight the silence felt different, heavy, suffocating. Her eagle was perched nearby, completely still, watching, always watching. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She was being ridiculous. She needed to stop, to let go of whatever doubts had buried themselves into her mind. Tomorrow, she would marry Daniel. Tomorrow, everything would be fine. At least, that's what she told herself. But, as she turned off the lights and made her way to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that her eagle's eyes never left her. And deep down, she knew why. The morning of the wedding arrived with an eerie stillness. Amalia woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the day pressed down on her chest. This should have been the happiest morning of her life, the moment she had spent months preparing for, but all she felt was a strange, suffocating emptiness. The house was already alive with movement, voices murmuring in the halls, the clatter of makeup brushes and hurried footsteps filling the space. Her mother had barely slept, too excited to see her only daughter walk down the aisle. The wedding planner had arrived early, making sure every last detail was executed flawlessly. Lauren had been the only one to look at her with caution, a silent question in her eyes that Amalia refused to answer. She sat in front of the vanity, watching as the makeup artist delicately applied blush to her cheekbones. The woman was speaking about how radiant brides always had a certain glow, how love had a way of making beauty shine even brighter. Amalia wasn't listening. Her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memories of the past few weeks, of every warning she had ignored, of every uneasy moment she had brushed aside. Her golden eagle was perched near the window, wings tucked, gaze fixed on the garden outside. He had not left her side all morning. He had moved only when she did, his presence a silent force pressing against her, an unspoken message she still wasn't ready to acknowledge. Her wedding dress hung on the other side of the room, a masterpiece of ivory lace and delicate embroidery. It was perfect. Every detail, from the subtle beading on the bodice to the way the fabric cascaded in soft waves, was exactly how she had envisioned it. She had spent months planning this day, obsessing over every little element to make sure it was flawless. And yet, as she sat there, staring at her own reflection, she felt nothing but doubt. Lauren appeared beside her, arms crossed, her bridesmaid gown a deep shade of red that complemented her complexion perfectly. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching Amalia through the mirror. Then, finally, she spoke. "You don't have to do this." Amalia's fingers tightened in her lap. "I know." The words felt foreign on her tongue, as if she had spoken them by mistake. Lauren held her gaze. "Then why are you—" A knock at the door made them both turn. Her mother stepped inside, beaming. "Sweetheart, the car is here. It's time." Amalia's breath caught in her throat. Time. She stood, smoothing her hands over the silk of her bridal robe. Her mother fussed over the final touches, adjusting her veil, making sure every strand of hair was in place. Lauren didn't move, didn't speak, but Amalia could feel her presence, the weight of her unspoken thoughts pressing against her. Her eagle let out a sharp, piercing cry. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. He was still perched by the window, his eyes locked onto the world beyond, his body tense as if he were preparing for something unseen. Her mother frowned. "He's been making that sound all morning." Amalia swallowed, forcing herself to smile. "He's just restless." But she knew that wasn't true. The ride to the wedding venue passed in silence. Her mother chatted excitedly, talking about the guests, the ceremony, the moment she had dreamed of since Amalia was a child. Lauren sat beside her, silent. Amalia kept her eyes on the window, watching as the city streets blurred past. Her eagle was in a separate vehicle, transported by a handler who had reluctantly agreed to let him stay at the venue. She hadn't been able to leave him behind. Not today. When they arrived, everything was perfect. The garden was bathed in golden light, the white roses lining the aisle in full bloom, the elegant canopy draped in soft fabric swaying gently in the breeze. The guests were already seated, murmuring in excitement, their faces filled with admiration as they turned to catch glimpses of the bride. The music had begun, a soft, instrumental melody drifting through the air. Daniel stood at the altar, his hands folded in front of him, exuding the quiet confidence that had drawn her to him in the first place. He was watching her, smiling, waiting. This was it. A deep breath. She took her first step forward. The fabric of her dress trailed behind her as she moved through the opening onto the aisle. The guests rose from their seats, their faces turning toward her in admiration. She saw smiles, flashes of camera lights, the way people whispered to one another about how breathtaking she looked. And then her eyes met Daniel's. He was watching her with that same easy confidence, his expression warm, his smile perfect. Everything about him seemed right. And yet, something in her gut told her otherwise. Her eagle tensed. She barely had time to register it before everything unraveled. A shriek tore through the air, sharp and powerful, cutting through the delicate melody of the wedding music. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Amalia's eagle launched from his perch, his massive wings slicing through the air. He dove forward, past the guests, past the officiant, past the carefully arranged floral displays, straight toward Daniel. Time seemed to slow. Daniel's expression shifted. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in something else. Surprise. Anger. He barely had time to react before the eagle struck. The force of impact sent Daniel stumbling back, his hands flying up to shield himself as the eagle's talons latched onto his shoulders. The guests screamed. The wedding planner shrieked. Chairs toppled as people scrambled away from the chaos unfolding at the altar. Amalia's mother clutched her chest in horror. Lauren moved without hesitation, stepping closer to Amalia as if bracing for what would come next. Daniel hit the ground hard. The eagle loomed over him, wings spread wide, his sharp beak inches from Daniel's face, his talons gripping his suit. He did not attack, but his body was rigid, every muscle coiled, his eyes locked onto the man beneath him with unwavering intensity. A stunned silence fell over the venue. The officiant took a horrified step back, the book clutched in his trembling hands. Someone shouted for security. Daniel struggled beneath the eagle, his hands pressing against the bird's feathers in an attempt to shove him off. The moment he did, the eagle's cry deepened, his talons tightening. He had not drawn blood, not yet, but he could. And then, in that moment, as Daniel's face contorted in frustration, Amalia saw it. The flicker of something dark in his expression, the anger, the frustration, the brief moment when his mask slipped. It was just a second, just long enough for her to catch it. But it was enough to make her realize, enough to make her finally see. Lauren moved before Amalia could react, her voice cutting through the noise. "Amalia!" She turned. Lauren wasn't looking at her. She was staring at someone in the crowd. A woman had pushed her way to the front, clutching a phone in her hands, her face pale, her expression tense. "I need to speak to you," the woman said, her voice shaking. Now, Amalia barely had time to process what was happening before security rushed in. Two men grabbed the eagle, pulling him away despite his resistance. The moment he was forced back, Daniel scrambled to his feet, brushing himself off with quick, jerky movements. His entire demeanor had changed. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw tight. The easygoing charm he had always exuded was suddenly gone. He looked at Amalia, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked afraid. The air was thick with tension, suffocating in its weight. The once picturesque wedding venue, adorned with golden drapery and pristine white roses, had become a battlefield of silence, broken only by the hushed murmurs of the stunned guests. The altar, where Amalia had been meant to exchange vows, now stood as the backdrop to a spectacle no one had expected. The golden eagle, restrained by two security guards, let out a deep, guttural cry. His amber eyes locked onto Daniel with a predator's gaze. His wings twitched, his muscles coiled, his entire being radiating resistance. He had been dragged away, but not silenced. Not yet. Daniel stood near the altar, his suit slightly rumpled, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the crowd as though calculating his next move. Gone was the composed, easy-going man Amalia had believed him to be, the man who had charmed his way into her life, into her heart. His mask had cracked, and for the first time she saw him as he truly was. Not the perfect, accomplished lawyer, not the man her mother adored, not the man her friends envied. Just a man who had spent years carefully curating an illusion. And now it was slipping away. Amalia felt her pulse hammer in her ears. Her fingers gripped the lace of her dress, the delicate fabric twisting beneath the force of her trembling hands. The woman with the phone stepped forward, her breath unsteady, her fingers shaking as she held out the screen. The glow of the device cast shadows across her pale face. She looked terrified, but more than that, she looked determined. "You need to see this," she said. Amalia hesitated, her body refusing to move even as her mind screamed at her to take the phone, to read whatever truth was waiting for her on the screen. She glanced at Daniel. His expression had darkened. His eyes, once filled with warmth, were now sharp, calculating. A flicker of something cold passed through them, something that made her stomach tighten with a dread she didn't yet fully understand. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice controlled but forced. "Are you really going to listen to some stranger over me?" Amalia's throat was dry. She swallowed against the tightness. "Who is she?" The woman's grip on the phone tightened. "I was supposed to marry him." A sharp, collective inhale rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered something, too low for Amalia to make out. The words echoed in her head over and over, layering themselves on top of every doubt, every hesitation she had buried. I was supposed to marry him. She already knew what the woman was going to say before she even said it. I found out too late, the woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. By the time I realized who he really was, I had already lost everything. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head again, but Amalia saw the way his fingers twitched at his sides, the way his weight shifted slightly as if preparing for something. She turned back to the phone and took it. Her fingers felt numb as she scrolled through the messages, the images, the undeniable proof. Fraud, manipulation, a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. She wasn't the first. She wasn't even close. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs spreading through the guests like wildfire. Her breaths came shallow, the edges of her vision blurring. The text messages detailed everything: carefully orchestrated deceptions, financial control, the same rehearsed lies he had fed to multiple women before her, bank transfers, conversations about moving money, small inconsistencies she had brushed off before now, glaring at her like neon warnings she had refused to see. She lifted her gaze back to Daniel, the man who had promised her forever. His hands were clenched at his sides. His expression had hardened, his jaw ticking as he realized there was no talking his way out of this. She could see the moment it hit him, the moment he knew, she knew, and for the first time since she had met him, Daniel looked afraid. The silence that followed was suffocating. The guests had stopped murmuring. Some stared in wide-eyed horror, others looked away as if pretending they hadn't just witnessed the collapse of an entire illusion. The officiant stood frozen in place, his book still clutched in his hands, but he wasn't reading from it anymore. Amalia took a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the phone before she lowered it to her side. "I don't think this is a mistake," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel's jaw tightened. She turned to the woman who had given her the phone. "You knew him," she said, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. The woman hesitated before nodding. "He's not who you think he is." The weight of the words settled over the gathering like a suffocating fog. Amalia turned back to Daniel. "Is this true?" His lips parted, but he didn't answer right away. The hesitation was answer enough. He let out a humorless laugh, but there was no amusement in it. "Are you really going to believe this?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "Over me?" She held up the phone. "Do you have an explanation for this?" His expression flickered, a crack in the facade, a tell. He took a step forward. Instantly, the eagle let out a sharp, piercing cry, his body jerking against the security guards restraining him. The force of his struggle nearly pulled them off balance. His wings flared, his talons scraped against the ground, his entire being resisting the distance that had been put between him and Amalia. Daniel stopped. His eyes flicked toward the eagle. For the first time, Amalia saw something she had never seen in him before. Not anger, not frustration, fear. A cold realization slithered through her veins. The eagle had known. He had always known. She took a step back. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it felt monumental. Daniel saw it. His expression darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dropping lower. Amalia exhaled. "No." The words felt strange, foreign in her mouth, but the more she said them, the more she believed them. "I almost made a mistake." The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Some guests exchanged glances, others whispered to one another. Daniel's face darkened. Lauren moved beside Amalia, her presence steady, grounding. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Amalia lifted her chin. "I'm not marrying you." The words fell between them like an iron weight. The silence stretched. Daniel's expression hardened, but he didn't speak. And then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. The moment he disappeared from sight, the eagle let out a low, steady sound. A final cry of warning. Or maybe of victory. Amalia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was over. The guests stood in stunned silence, waiting for something, anything to signal what came next. Lauren was the first to break it. "Well," she said, clapping her hands together, "that was a hell of a show." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Amalia didn't move. She felt frozen, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. The adrenaline, the shock, the realization of how close she had come to making the worst mistake of her life. The eagle was still watching her. She met his gaze. For the first time in a long time, she listened. The wedding was over, but not in the way anyone had expected. The perfectly arranged venue now felt like a hollow shell of what it had once been, an illusion shattered, leaving nothing but whispers and speculation in its wake. Guests lingered in hesitant clusters, uncertain whether they should stay or leave. Some approached Amalia with quiet words of sympathy. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if pretending they hadn't just witnessed the most humiliating moment of her life. The officiant gave her an awkward pat on the shoulder before disappearing into the crowd, while her mother stood frozen, expression torn between devastation and something resembling reluctant relief. Amalia stood at the edge of it all, her wedding dress feeling heavier than ever, the intricate lace and delicate embroidery a cruel reminder of the life she had almost stepped into. The weight of her decisions pressed against her chest, suffocating, relentless. She had spent years believing in a future with Daniel, convincing herself that he was the right choice, the safe choice. She had built an entire life around that belief. And now, in a matter of minutes, it had all fallen apart. Lauren appeared beside her, a glass of champagne in one hand, her deep red bridesmaid dress slightly wrinkled from the chaos of the afternoon. She studied Amalia for a moment before speaking. "You okay?" Amalia exhaled, her fingers tightening around the delicate fabric of her gown. "I don't know." Lauren nodded, as if she had expected that answer. She held out the champagne. "Drink." Amalia hesitated before accepting the glass, bringing it to her lips. The bubbles fizzed against her tongue, but the taste was distant, dull, lost beneath the numbness that had settled inside her. Her mother finally broke her silence, stepping closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice carefully measured, "we can still do something. A smaller reception, maybe? Just close friends and family?" Amalia stared at her, disbelief flickering across her face. "A smaller reception?" Her mother hesitated. "I just mean, this doesn't have to define everything. People will talk, but they'll move on. You still deserve to celebrate." Celebrate. The word felt wrong. A bitter laugh escaped before she could stop it. "Mom, I just called off my wedding. I don't think champagne and dancing are going to fix that." Her mother sighed, glancing at the murmuring guests. "People will forget, Amalia. Eventually. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't." Either way, it didn't change the fact that she had almost married a man she barely knew, almost tied herself to a stranger whose life had been built on manipulation and deception. The thought made her stomach churn. Lauren took another sip of her drink, unfazed by the tension hanging in the air. For what it's worth, you dodged a missile today. Not even a bullet. A full-scale, life-destroying missile. Amalia let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting toward the edge of the venue where the security guards had finally released her eagle. He sat perched on a low railing, wings tucked in, watching her with sharp, unblinking eyes. He was calmer now, no longer thrashing, no longer resisting. It was as if he knew. The danger had passed. "I should have listened to him," she murmured. Lauren followed her gaze. "Yeah, you should have." Amalia swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was making the right choice, ignoring every sign, every hesitation. And now, standing in the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of her life, all she felt was exhaustion. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll get through this," she promised. Amalia didn't answer. She wasn't sure what getting through this even meant. The guests were leaving now, filtering out in small groups, their voices still tinged with disbelief. Some gave her sympathetic looks, others simply nodded before slipping away. A few members of Daniel's family stood at a distance, their expressions unreadable, their conversations hushed. They didn't approach her. They didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. The wedding planner, looking like she wanted to be anywhere but here, approached hesitantly. "Do you want us to pack up the decorations, the flowers, or would you prefer get rid of it?" Amalia cut in, her voice steadier than she expected. The planner blinked. "All of it?" "Yes." The woman nodded quickly before hurrying off to relay the orders. Lauren finished her champagne and stretched her arms above her head. "So, what now?" Amalia stared at the remnants of her wedding, the flowers, the tables, the chairs that had been knocked over in the chaos. "I think I need to get out of here." Lauren nodded approvingly. "Good, because I already told the caterers to pack up some of the food, and I may or may not have stolen a bottle of the good champagne." Amalia glanced at her. "You did what?" Lauren shrugged. "Figured if we're going to sit around and process this mess, we might as well do it with decent food and alcohol." Despite everything, despite the ache in her chest and the weight pressing down on her lungs, Amalia felt the faintest tug of a smile. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. She turned toward her eagle. "You up for some takeout and bad decisions?" His head tilted slightly, amber eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. It felt like a yes. That was all the answer she needed. Hours later, Amalia found herself sitting on the floor of her apartment, still in her wedding dress, now barefoot, her hair undone, her makeup smudged from rubbing her eyes too many times. Lauren sat beside her, legs stretched out, chopsticks in one hand, a champagne flute in the other. The coffee table was littered with takeout containers, half-empty glasses, and discarded napkins. The television played quietly in the background, some reality show neither of them were paying attention to. The eagle perched nearby, his gaze occasionally flicking toward the windows as if still on high alert. Lauren took a bite of noodles and nudged Amalia with her foot. "On a scale of 1 to 10, how tempted are you to fake your own death and move to another country?" Amalia exhaled. "About a 12. Lauren raised her glass. "Understandable." Amalia stared at the television, her mind still racing, still replaying everything that had happened. Every choice she had made, every warning she had ignored. She had been so sure about Daniel. so convinced that she had finally found the right person. But her eagle had known better. Lauren nudged her shoulder. "Hey." Amalia turned her head. "You're going to be okay," Lauren said, her voice softer now. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but you will be." Amalia swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe that, and maybe, just maybe, she did. The days stretched into weeks, and the chaos of the failed wedding began to settle into something softer, something quieter. The headlines faded, the whispers dulled, and life, as it always did, moved on. Amalia spent the first few days in a haze of exhaustion, avoiding phone calls, ignoring messages, refusing to engage in any conversation about Daniel. Her mother tried to check in, carefully tiptoeing around the topic, but Amalia wasn't ready. Lauren had been her shield, fielding calls and running interference, but even she knew that Amalia couldn't stay in limbo forever. The golden eagle remained her silent guardian, never straying far from her side. His presence was steady, grounded, a reminder that she had made the right choice, even if it didn't feel like it yet. He seemed lighter now, less on edge, as if his mission had been completed, as if he had done what he had always set out to do, protect her. She let herself move through the motions, taking long walks through the city, wandering through bookstores without any real intention of buying anything, sitting in coffee shops and watching the world move around her. For the first time in a long time, there was no pressure, no expectation, no plan. And that, more than anything, terrified her. She had spent years meticulously crafting the life she thought she wanted. She had worked hard, made careful choices, followed the path that had always been laid out before her. But now, standing on the other side of something she had once believed was her future, she realized she had no idea who she was outside of it. One afternoon, while scrolling aimlessly on her phone, she found herself looking at an old photo of her and her eagle. It had been taken years ago, before Daniel, before all of this. They were at an animal sanctuary, surrounded by birds of prey, their talons gripping leather gloves, their sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. She had volunteered there for a time, before life had gotten too busy, before she had convinced herself that she didn't have time. She stared at the photo for a long time, feeling something stir inside her. The next morning, she found herself standing outside that same sanctuary. The building hadn't changed much. The brick structure still had the same slightly faded sign hanging above the door. Inside, the scent of clean straw and disinfectant filled the air, mixed with the faint, familiar sounds of birds rustling in their enclosures. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Hi there, can I help you?" Amalia hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish for showing up without a plan. But before she could second-guess herself, she found herself saying, "I was wondering if you needed volunteers." The woman's smile widened. "We always need volunteers." And just like that, Amalia started spending her days at the sanctuary. At first, it was just a few hours here and there, helping with feedings, cleaning enclosures, learning about the rehabilitation process. But as the days passed, she found herself staying longer, losing track of time, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized she had been missing. Her eagle was a fixture there, too. The staff adored him, and the other birds seemed to look to him for some kind of silent guidance. He was patient with the younger ones, gentle with the injured ones, always watching, always aware. One afternoon, as she was finishing up for the day, she walked past a row of enclosures and stopped. Curled up in the corner of his space was an older golden eagle. His feathers were darker, his talons thick, his eyes clouded with age but still sharp, still holding a quiet intensity. Unlike the other birds, who eagerly moved at the sight of visitors, he simply watched her, his head tilting slightly. Her heart clenched. She knelt down, pressing her fingers against the metal bars. "Who's this?" One of the staff members walked over. "That's Titan. He's been here a while. Older birds are harder to place." Titan lifted his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers. Amalia swallowed past the lump in her throat. She knew that feeling, being overlooked, being left behind. She exhaled. "I'll take him." The staff member blinked. "You want to adopt him?" She nodded. "Yeah, I do." Titan was hesitant at first, unsure of her eagle, unsure of his new surroundings. But within hours of being home, he had settled into the space as if he had always belonged. That night, she sat on the floor of her apartment, her eagle perched beside her, Titan on the other side. She ran her fingers through the older bird's feathers, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. She had spent so much time grieving a future that had never been real, mourning a life that had never truly been hers. But sitting here now, surrounded by the quiet comfort of these two birds who had come into her life at different times, but for the same reason, she realized that she had gained something far more valuable. She had found herself again, and maybe, just maybe, that was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot, and let us know in the comments, what would you do in her place?